The smell hit me before anything else. Lavender, soft but unmistakable, clinging to the leather the way perfume does when someone wants to be remembered. It did not belong to me. I stood there for a moment with one foot on the driveway and one hand on the open car door, breathing it in as if that might help me place it somewhere harmless. The morning was clear and already warm, the kind of Southern California morning that promises nothing unusual, and yet something in my chest tightened, quiet and instinctive. I had leaned into the car for one reason only, my sunglasses. I was running late for a grocery run, and I did not want to squint the whole way there. It was such a small thing, the kind of errand you forget about the moment it is done. I slid into the driver's seat without thinking, my knee brushing the steering wheel that Michael had adjusted to his height, not mine. 22 years of marriage, and that small difference still existed. I had never bothered to change it. The lavender lingered. It did not fade the way a passing scent should. It felt intentional, settled, like it had been there for a while. I closed my eyes for a second and told myself what I had told myself many times before. Do not be dramatic. You are tired. You are reading meaning into nothing. Michael had meetings. He had clients. He had a life that did not always overlap neatly with mine, and that was normal at our age. Still, my hand paused on the center console. I noticed details I had not noticed before. A coffee cup missing from the holder where it usually sat. The radio tuned to a station I did not recognize. A parking pass clipped to the visor from a place I had never been. None of these things meant anything on their own. Together, they made the inside of the car feel unfamiliar, like a room rearranged while you were asleep. I told myself to hurry. I reached for the compartment by the door, then the glove box, then the space between the seats where I sometimes tossed loose receipts. My fingers brushed against something hard and smooth that did not feel like paper or plastic trash. I frowned and leaned to the side, peering into the narrow gap between the driver's seat and the console. There it was, black, rectangular, wedged just out of sight. I froze. Not in panic, not yet, but in that suspended moment when your body reacts before your mind has caught up. I knew what it was before I pulled it out. I also knew that I did not want it to be what it was. I told myself I was imagining things. Michael worked in finance. He traveled sometimes. People his age had old devices lying around all the time. Backup phones, work phones, outdated models that never got recycled. There were reasonable explanations. I held on to those explanations the way you hold on to a railing when the ground feels unsteady. My fingers closed around it and I slid it free. A phone. Older model. No case. No visible cracks. Clean in a way that suggested it was still being used. It felt heavier than my own phone, or maybe my hand was shaking. I could not tell. For a few seconds, I just stared at it resting on my palm, the sun glinting off the dark screen. The lavender scent seemed stronger now, or maybe I was only noticing it more. I should have put it back. I know that now. I should have placed it exactly where I found it and walked into the house and waited for Michael to come home and asked him directly. That is what the woman I had been for most of my life would have done. I believed in conversations. I believed in giving the benefit of the doubt. I believed that long marriages earned explanations, but something had shifted. Not suddenly, not violently, but enough that I could feel it. A small internal click, like a lock turning. I pressed the power button. The screen lit up immediately. No password, no delay, just a simple home screen with a handful of apps. Messages, email, calendar, notes. The sight of it made my stomach drop. Not because of what was on it yet, but because of what was not. There was no hesitation built into this device, no barrier. It was meant to be accessed easily by someone who already knew it existed. I sat there in the quiet car, listening to the distant sound of a neighbor starting their lawnmower, aware of my own breathing. I thought about how many times I had sat in this seat over the years. Road trips, hospital visits for aging parents, late-night drives home after dinners with friends. The phone had been inches away from me all that time, invisible only because I trusted the space it was hidden in. I opened the messages. I did not read everything at once. At first, my eyes skimmed without fully taking it in, names I did not recognize, conversations that picked up mid-thought, as if there was a shared history I was not part of. Dates, times, familiar restaurants mentioned casually, places Michael had told me he was too tired to go, or too busy, or not in the mood. I stopped scrolling. My name was not there, not once, not as a complaint, not as an obstacle, not even as a lie. I was not referenced at all. That absence was louder than anything else I could have found. A memory surfaced without warning. Michael standing in our kitchen 6 months earlier, loosening his tie, telling me he would be late again because a client dinner had been rescheduled. His voice had been calm, almost apologetic. I remembered nodding and saying it was fine, that I would save him a plate. I remembered how relieved he looked that I did not ask questions. Another memory followed, a weekend trip he had canceled at the last minute, a charity event I attended alone because he had not been feeling well. Small disappointments I had folded into the fabric of our life and called normal. My chest felt hollow, then tight. I closed my eyes and pressed my fingers against them until faint sparks appeared. You already know, a quiet thought surfaced. You have known for a while. You just did not want to see it. I lowered my hands and looked at the phone again. It was not just messages. The calendar showed a pattern. Regular dinners on the same nights of the week, short trips that did not line up with anything he had told me, gaps in his schedule where he had said he was working from home but apparently had not been home at all. This was not chaos, it was structure. The realization settled slowly. Michael was not hiding something from me. He was living something without me. A parallel rhythm had been running alongside our life, steady and intentional, and I had been moving to a different beat entirely. I felt an urge to get out of the car, to put distance between myself and that realization. The driveway suddenly felt exposed, as if someone might see me sitting there and know what I was holding. I slipped the phone into the pocket of my cardigan and stepped out, locking the car behind me with hands that did not quite feel like mine. Inside the house, everything looked the same. The framed photos on the hallway wall, the bowl of keys on the entry table, the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stood there for a moment and let the normalcy wash over me, wondering how many mornings had started like this without my noticing what was already wrong. I walked into the kitchen and set my purse down. My sunglasses were still somewhere in the car, forgotten. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it too quickly, then leaned against the counter and stared out the window at the backyard Michael and I had landscaped together years ago. The roses needed trimming. The patio furniture was still covered from winter, life waiting to be maintained. I told myself this was only the beginning. Not of a confrontation, not of a decision, but of awareness. I did not know yet what I was going to do. I only knew that whatever Michael had built on the side, whatever second life he had carved out, I had not been invited into it. And standing there in my quiet kitchen, with the weight of that phone still pressing against my hip, I understood that I could not unknow it. I picked up my glass and carried it to the sink. My movements deliberate, careful, outside, The sound of the lawnmower faded. The house settled around me. Somewhere beneath that calm, something else had begun to move, patient and watchful, waiting for me to take the next step. I stayed at the sink longer than necessary, letting the quiet stretch until it felt less sharp. The phone pressed against my hip like a secret with weight. I did not pull it out again right away. I needed a moment to steady myself, to pretend that the normal rhythm of the house could still be trusted to hold me up. I finished my water, rinsed the glass, and set it in the rack with care. Every movement felt deliberate, as if the way I placed the glass mattered more than it ever had before. I told myself I would put the phone back in the car later, exactly where I found it, and that this would all become something to laugh about once Michael explained it. That was the story I offered myself, not because I believed it, but because it was the only one that allowed me to keep breathing normally. I walked down the hallway to the small sitting room we rarely used. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a pale stripe of sunlight that fell across the armchair by the window. I sat down and slipped the phone from my pocket, resting it on my knee. My hands were steady now, which surprised me. The initial shock had dulled into something quieter and more focused. I opened it again. This time, I did not start with the messages. I went to the home screen and looked at the layout, the way someone might study a stranger's living room to understand how they lived. There were only a few apps installed, nothing flashy, no games, no social media I recognized. Everything on this phone had a purpose. The email app was next. I tapped it and waited, half expecting a password prompt to appear and stop me. It did not. The inbox loaded instantly, filling the screen with addresses I did not know. Some were personal, some looked like work, but not the kind of work Michael did with his main clients. The tone of the messages was different, casual, where his work emails were formal, familiar in a way that made my stomach turn. I scrolled slowly. The dates went back months, then years. This was not a recent development. This was a parallel archive of his life, carefully maintained. One message caught my attention because it mentioned a dinner reservation. The name of the restaurant was familiar. It was a place by the water we used to go to before crowds and noise started to bother Michael. He had said it had lost its charm. The email mentioned a table by the window, a favorite spot. I remembered suggesting that exact table once, years ago, and being told it was too drafty. I did not read every word. I did not need to. The shape of the thing was becoming clear. I switched to the calendar. Seeing it laid out like that was worse. Blocks of time marked with simple labels, dinners, meetings, travel. None of it was marked as tentative. None of it looked like the kind of calendar you kept when you were improvising or sneaking around. This was organized. Repeating events appeared on the same days of the week, certain Fridays, certain Sundays. Patterns I had never questioned because I had been given reasonable explanations for all of them. I found myself counting backward, aligning what I saw on the screen with what I remembered. That Sunday, 2 summers ago, when Michael said he needed a quiet afternoon to catch up on paperwork. The Tuesday nights, he said his networking group met later than usual. The weekend trip he took alone because I had a cold and he did not want to risk getting sick. The phone did not argue with me. It simply confirmed. I rested my head against the back of the chair and closed my eyes. For a moment, I felt very old, not in years, but in the sudden awareness of time already spent. 22 years is a long stretch of shared routines. It is long enough that you stop questioning the scaffolding holding your life together. I opened my eyes and went back to the messages, this time scrolling further down, past the most recent conversations. I noticed something else then. The way people spoke to him here was not the way clients spoke to him. There was affection, assumptions of availability, jokes that relied on shared experiences I had never been part of. And still, my name was nowhere. That absence began to feel deliberate, not just an omission, but a boundary. Whatever this was, it had been built in a way that did not require erasing me actively. I had simply never been included. I thought about Michael as I knew him, the man who liked his coffee strong and his toast almost burned, the man who complained about his knee on cold mornings, the man who folded his shirts the same way every time and insisted it save space. None of that was visible here. This phone belonged to a version of him that did not need those details. A memory rose up uninvited. Michael laughing at something on his phone late one night, the glow of the screen lighting his face. I had asked what was funny. He had said it was a client joke, nothing interesting. I remembered shrugging and turning back to my book. I stayed with that memory longer than I wanted to. The sound of a car passing outside pulled me back. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Michael would not be home for hours. That knowledge brought a strange sense of relief. I was not ready to see him yet. I was not ready to carry this awareness into the same room where he would look at me with a familiar expression and expect me to play my part. I picked up my own phone from the side table and checked it out of habit. A missed call from my sister earlier that morning, a reminder about a dentist appointment, ordinary things, anchored to the life I thought I was living. I set it down and returned my attention to the other phone. There was one app I had not opened yet, Notes. I hesitated, then tapped it. What I saw there was not dramatic. No confessions, no declarations, just lists, addresses, numbers, short phrases that meant nothing on their own. I did not understand most of it, but the care with which it had been recorded unsettled me. This was not the behavior of someone acting on impulse. This was the behavior of someone who planned. I stopped myself before going further. Something in me recognized that crossing that line would change the nature of what I knew. I needed to be able to function, to think clearly, to remember that this was still my life, my home, my marriage, even if it no longer felt that way. I locked the phone and placed it face down on the table beside me. My reflection in the dark screen looked older than it had that morning, more alert, less forgiving. I sat there for a long time, listening to the faint sounds of the neighborhood, a dog barking, someone closing a garage door, life moving along as it always did. I wondered how many other women were sitting in houses like mine at that exact moment, sensing something was wrong and talking themselves out of it. When I finally stood up, my legs felt stiff. I carried the phone back down the hallway and into the bedroom. I opened the closet and slipped it into the back of a drawer beneath folded sweaters, a place Michael never looked. The act felt strangely ceremonial, like acknowledging that this object now belonged to me, at least for the moment. I changed out of my shoes and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. My heart was beating normally again. That scared me more than the panic had. Calm meant this was settling into me, becoming part of my understanding of the world. I did not know yet what this would mean for us. I did not know what I would do with what I had found. All I knew was that the crack I had noticed earlier was real, and that it ran deeper than I had imagined. Whatever came next would require me to see clearly, without rushing, without reaching for comfort too quickly. I lay back and closed my eyes, letting the ceiling fan hum softly overhead, somewhere between one breath and the next. I understood that this was no longer about catching Michael in a lie. It was about learning the shape of the life he had built alongside mine and deciding whether I was willing to keep living in its shadow. I did not sleep that afternoon. I lay there listening to the fan turn above me, counting the seconds between each rotation, letting my mind drift just far enough to touch the edges of what I had seen before pulling it back again. Every time I started to relax, an image would surface, a restaurant name, a block of time on a calendar, a message written as if the rest of the world did not exist. When I finally got up, the light outside had shifted. The backyard looked washed out, pale and flat, as if someone had turned down the contrast. I moved through the house slowly, aware of my own footsteps, of how quiet everything was when Michael was not there. The quiet had never bothered me before. That day it felt like a test. I went into the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea, chamomile, even though it was still early afternoon. My hands moved automatically. Kettle, mug, tea bag, steam rising. I stood at the counter and watched it curl into the air, thinking about how many times I had done this exact thing while believing I understood the shape of my life. I did not pick up the phone again right away. Instead, I let my memory do some of the work for me. I thought about the dinners Michael said were networking events, the way he always dressed a little differently for those nights. Nothing obvious, just a sharper jacket, shoes polished more carefully. I had teased him once about it, asking if he was trying to impress someone. He had laughed and kissed my cheek and said, "You never know who you might meet." At the time, it sounded harmless, sensible, even. I thought about the weekends he traveled alone, not often, but often enough that I could list them now without effort. He always brought back small gifts, a scarf, a book, a candle from a shop. He said he passed by and thought of me. I remembered feeling touched by that, remembered telling myself how lucky I was to have a husband who noticed things like that. The tea went untouched on the counter. I carried it into the living room and sat on the couch, staring at the framed photos on the wall opposite me. Vacations, family gatherings, weddings we had attended together. Michael's arm always around my shoulder, his smile easy, practiced. I had never doubted that smile. I had never asked myself who else saw it, or how often. I realized then that the phone had not shown me something entirely new. It had given shape to what had already been there, just out of focus. I picked up the phone again. This time I was not looking for proof. I already had that. I was looking for context. I opened the calendar and tapped on a date from the previous year. A Thursday in late spring. The entry said dinner. Just that. I remembered that night. I had made myself scrambled eggs because Michael said he would be home late and not hungry. I remembered watching a rerun of a show we used to enjoy together, half listening, half waiting for the sound of his car in the driveway. I tapped another date, Sunday afternoon, brunch. I remembered that Sunday too. I had gone to the farmer's market alone, bought too many peaches, and texted Michael to ask if he wanted me to save him some. He had replied hours later with a smiley face and said, "Sure." The phone was not cruel. It did not mock me. It simply lined things up. I began to understand that this was not an affair in the way I had always imagined affairs. There was no chaos here, no sudden break from routine. This had been folded into the rhythm of his life so neatly that I had never felt the seam. What unsettled me most was how complete it looked. The people he met with appeared consistently, the locations repeated. This was not a series of stolen moments. It was a schedule. I thought about the word second life and how dramatic it sounded. I would not have used it before that day. It felt like something out of a movie, exaggerated and distant. And yet, sitting there with the phone warm in my hands, I could not think of another phrase that fit as well. There was a version of Michael that woke up on certain days, already knowing where he would go and who would be waiting for him. A version of Michael that did not need to check in with me or explain himself, or adjust his plans around mine. That version existed alongside the one who sat across from me at dinner and asked how my day had been. I wondered if he ever felt the strain of that division, if there were moments when he nearly slipped, or if it all felt natural to him, an expansion rather than a fracture. My thoughts drifted to myself, to the way my own days had narrowed over the years. I worked less, traveled less, let my world shrink quietly around the space Michael occupied. I had not resented it. I had called it stability, partnership, maturity. I set the phone down and pressed my palms against my thighs. A sharp clarity cut through the fog of shock. This was not only about what Michael had done, it was about what I had allowed myself to stop noticing. The front door opened later than usual that evening. I heard Michael's keys hit the bowl in the entryway, heard his familiar steps down the hall. My body reacted before my mind did, a small tightening in my shoulders, a readiness I had never needed before. He appeared in the doorway to the living room, smiling, loosening his tie. "Long day," he said, his voice warm and tired in the way that used to feel comforting. I nodded and said yes, same here. The words came easily, too easily. He sat down beside me and reached for my hand, his thumb brushing the inside of my wrist. The touch felt the same. That surprised me. I had expected it to feel foreign or wrong. Instead, it felt exactly as it always had. That frightened me more than anything else. We talked about nothing, about traffic, about a neighbor's new car, about what we might have for dinner. I answered him automatically, my mind tracking every inflection, every pause, looking for cracks. There were none. At one point, he mentioned a dinner coming up later in the week, a client thing he could not get out of. He said it casually, the way he always did, and waited just long enough for me to respond. That was when it became unmistakable. He was not lying to me in that moment. He was editing. The dinner existed. That part was true. The version he gave me was simply incomplete. I smiled and told him that was fine, that I would make plans with a friend. His shoulders relaxed. I saw it clearly this time. The subtle release of tension, the satisfaction of a story landing where he expected it to. That night, lying in bed beside him, listening to his breathing even out as sleep took him, I stared at the ceiling and let the truth settle fully into place. I was not being cheated on in the traditional sense. I was being bypassed. Michael had not just stepped outside our marriage. He had constructed an entire version of his life that did not require me at all. I existed in one lane of his world, predictable and contained, while he moved freely through another. The realization did not come with tears. It came with a deep, steady ache, a sense of displacement, as if I had been living in a house only to discover there was an entire wing I had never been allowed to enter. I turned onto my side, facing away from him, and closed my eyes. Sleep did not come easily, but when it did, it was shallow and restless. Somewhere in the dark, I understood that I could not go back to the way things had been, not because I was angry, not yet, but because I had seen too much to pretend I still belonged where I thought I did. I woke the next morning with a dull heaviness behind my eyes, the kind that usually followed a night of poor sleep and too much thinking. Michael was already up. I could hear him in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of coffee being poured, a cabinet closing softly. For a moment, I lay still and tried to remember how many mornings had begun exactly like this, ordinary and unremarkable. The difference now was that I was awake to it. When I got out of bed, I moved carefully, as if any sudden motion might betray me. Michael glanced up when I entered the kitchen and smiled, the same small smile he always wore in the mornings. He asked if I slept well. I said well enough. Neither of us lingered on the question. We ate breakfast together, toast for him, yogurt for me. He read something on his phone, the one I had always known about, scrolling with his thumb. I watched him over the rim of my coffee cup and wondered how many versions of this quiet domestic moment he carried inside him, how easily he shifted between them. After he left for the day, I stood at the front window and watched his car pull away. Only when it disappeared around the corner did I let myself exhale fully. The house felt different in the daylight, less like a refuge and more like a stage I had been performing on without realizing it. I did not go back to the hidden phone right away. Instead, I walked through the house with new eyes. I noticed things I had not questioned before. A folder on the desk in the den labeled financial planning, which Michael usually handled. A locked drawer beneath it that I had never tried to open. A file cabinet in the garage with boxes stacked in front of it, inconveniently placed. None of this felt dramatic. That was what unsettled me. There was no single moment where everything tipped over. Just a gradual accumulation of small decisions that had shifted the balance of power without my noticing. I sat down at the dining table with a legal pad and a pen. I had not written anything by hand in a while. My fingers felt stiff around the pen at first. I wrote down what I knew, not what I suspected, but what I could say with certainty. The phone existed. It contained a separate calendar and email. There were repeated events that did not include me. That was all. Seeing it written down steadied me. It gave the situation edges. I thought about money, about how long it had been since I had reviewed our accounts in detail. Michael had always been good with numbers. That was part of what drew me to him early on. Organized, thoughtful, careful, over time. I had let him take over more and more of the practical decisions. It felt efficient. It felt like trust. I opened my laptop and logged into the main account we shared. The balances looked normal at first glance. Mortgage, utilities, savings, nothing missing, nothing alarming. But when I clicked into the transaction history, I noticed transfers that I could not place. Not large amounts, just enough to be invisible unless you were looking closely. Consistent, regular. I copied down the dates and amounts onto the legal pad. A memory surfaced from years ago, Michael explaining how moving money around could be beneficial for tax purposes. I remembered nodding, half listening, trusting that he had it under control. That trust had been a kind of relief. I had wanted someone else to hold that responsibility. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. This was not about discovering a crime. It was about recognizing a pattern. Later that afternoon, I drove to a small coffee shop near the library, a place Michael never went. I ordered a plain coffee and sat by the window, watching people come and go. I pulled the hidden phone from my bag and placed it on the table beside my cup. It looked out of place there, anonymous and quiet. I opened the Notes app again. This time I forced myself to read more carefully. Addresses, account numbers, names abbreviated in ways I did not understand. There was no explanation attached to any of it. No context, just data. I realized then that this phone was not meant to be reflective. It was functional, a tool. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I did not copy anything down. I did not take photos. I simply observed. I wanted to understand the shape of what I was dealing with before I acted. I had learned over the years that rushing to confront something rarely led to clarity. On the drive home, I passed streets I had driven 1,000 times. I thought about how easily a life could be divided without anyone noticing, if the person doing the dividing was careful enough. I wondered how long Michael had been planning whatever this was, whether it had begun as something small and grown over time, or whether it had always been intentional. That evening, I called my friend Rachel. We had known each other since our 40s, since before Michael and I moved to this neighborhood. She answered on the second ring, and immediately asked if everything was all right. I told her yes, mostly, and asked how she was. We talked around the edges of things for a few minutes, weather and errands and the usual topics. Then she paused and said something that landed harder than she probably intended. She said I sounded tired, different. I almost laughed. Instead, I told her I had a lot on my mind. She hesitated, then said she had been meaning to check in on me anyway. She said Michael seemed distant lately, in her opinion, and that she hoped everything was fine. The words were gentle, careful, but they struck a nerve. I thanked her and said I was sure it was nothing. We changed the subject. After we hung up, I sat there with the phone in my hand and felt a familiar wave of regret. How many times had people offered me small openings like that? And how many times had I closed them because it was easier than asking questions I did not want answered? Michael came home later that night, tired and quiet. He kissed me on the cheek and went to wash his hands. We ate dinner together and talked about his day. He mentioned a meeting coming up with an advisor, someone I did not recognize. He said it casually, as if it were not worth explaining. I nodded and asked no questions. As we cleared the dishes, I noticed how comfortable he was in his certainty that I would not push. That certainty had been earned over years of my cooperation. That realization did not make me angry. It made me alert. When we went to bed, I lay awake again, but this time my thoughts were sharper. I was no longer just reacting. I was observing. The shift was subtle, but it mattered. I understood now that whatever Michael was doing, it was not only about another life running parallel to ours. It was about control, about who had access to information and who did not, about decisions being made quietly, with the assumption that I would not interfere. That assumption was the real fracture. I turned onto my side and watched the faint outline of Michael's back in the darkness. I did not feel hatred. I did not even feel betrayal in the way people usually describe it. What I felt was a steady resolve forming, the kind that comes when you realize you have been standing on uneven ground and decide to find your footing. I closed my eyes, knowing that I was done looking backward for reassurance. The next steps would require attention, patience, and a willingness to see things exactly as they were, not as I had believed them to be. I carried that resolve with me into the next day, though it did not feel as solid in practice as it had the night before. Resolve sounds firm and confident. What I felt instead was a careful tension, like holding a glass too close to the edge of a table and being constantly aware that one wrong movement could send it crashing down. The morning passed quietly. Michael left early for what he said would be a long day, kissed my cheek, reminded me that he might be late. I watched him go with a kind of detached focus, noting the ease with which he moved through our shared routines. There was no hesitation, no visible guilt. If anything, he seemed lighter, unburdened by whatever calculations occupied my own mind. After he left, I sat in the living room and let myself think about Rachel. Her comment from the day before echoed more loudly than I wanted it to. "You sound different." It was such a simple observation, but it carried weight because it came from someone who had known me through more than one version of myself. Rachel had seen me younger, sharper, more opinionated. She had also seen me soften over the years, settle into habits that felt comfortable but perhaps too accommodating. We had met in our 40s through a mutual friend, back when Michael and I still hosted dinner parties and believed our lives were expanding rather than narrowing. Rachel had always been perceptive, not suspicious, just attentive. She noticed shifts in tone, changes in posture, the way people spoke when they were leaving something unsaid. I picked up my phone and stared at her name for a long moment before calling. She answered quickly, her voice bright. She asked how I was, really. I told her I was fine, that I just wanted to see if she had time for coffee later in the week. There was a pause on the line, brief but unmistakable. Then she said she was free that afternoon if that worked. We met at a small cafe near her house, one of those places that prides itself on being unpretentious. Wooden tables, mismatched chairs, soft music playing low enough that you could hear yourself think. Rachel was already there when I arrived, seated by the window, a mug cradled between her hands. She smiled when she saw me, but her eyes searched my face as I sat down. She asked again how I was doing. I answered honestly this time, though not completely. I said I had been thinking a lot, that some things felt off. She nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something she had already suspected. She did not rush to fill the silence. That was one of the things I appreciated about her. After a moment, she said she had debated whether to bring this up before, and that she had not wanted to interfere or project her own assumptions. But she had noticed changes in Michael over the past year, not dramatic ones, subtle shifts. He had seemed more distracted, more careful with his words, less present when the three of us were together. She said she had wondered if it was stress or age or something else. She said she had hoped I was seeing things she was not. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded in my lap. Every part of me wanted to tell her everything, to place the weight of what I had discovered into someone else's hands. But another part of me hesitated. I was not ready to share details yet. I needed to understand more myself. I told her I appreciated her honesty. I told her I was paying attention now. That was true. She reached across the table and touched my hand briefly, a small gesture of support. She said she was there if I needed her. No pressure, no demands. When we parted, I felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter for having spoken out loud what I had only been circling in my head. Heavier because her observations reinforced that this was not something I had imagined on my own. On the drive home, I thought about all the moments when someone had nearly said something to me over the years, and how often I had been the one to change the subject first. It occurred to me that denial is not always loud. Sometimes it is polite. That evening, I decided to visit Evelyn. My mother-in-law lived across town in a small single-story house she had owned for decades. She was in her early 80s now, still sharp, still fiercely independent. Michael spoke to her every week, visited when he could. Their relationship was cordial, but not particularly warm. I had always assumed that was just their way. Evelyn seemed surprised but pleased when I showed up unannounced. She invited me in, fussed over whether I wanted tea or water, commented on how thin I looked. I sat at her kitchen table, the same one I had sat at countless times before, and watched her move around the room with practiced efficiency. We talked about ordinary things at first. Her garden, a neighbor who had moved away, the rising cost of groceries. I waited for an opening, not sure how to create one without being obvious. It came unexpectedly. She mentioned Michael's work, asked if things were still going well. Her tone was neutral, but there was something in her eyes that made me pause. I told her he seemed busy, that he traveled more than he used to. She nodded and said yes. He had always been good at keeping busy. She said it almost to herself. I asked her what she meant. She hesitated, then waved a hand dismissively, saying it was nothing. Old observations. She said Michael had always been private, even as a child, good at managing impressions. She said he liked things orderly, controlled. I waited. She sighed and sat down across from me. She said she did not mean to worry me. She said she assumed I and Michael talked about everything that mattered. She said she had trusted that if there were things she did not see clearly, it was because I saw them better. The words landed with a dull thud. I asked her if there was something she thought I should know. She looked at me for a long moment, then said she thought Michael sometimes compartmentalized too much, that he preferred clean lines between parts of his life, that he did not like overlap. She said it gently, without accusation, without drama. I thanked her for telling me. I did not ask more. I did not need to. The pattern was already forming clearly enough. When I left her house, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. I sat in my car for a few minutes before driving away, letting the weight of those conversations settle. Back home, I moved through the evening as I always had. I cooked dinner. I set the table. I waited for Michael. When he arrived, he seemed tired, but in good spirits. He asked about my day. I told him I had gone for coffee with Rachel, then stopped by to see his mother. His reaction was slight, but I caught it, a flicker of surprise, quickly masked. He asked how Evelyn was doing. I said she was well. He nodded, satisfied, and the conversation moved on. As we ate, I watched him carefully. The ease with which he navigated these small deceptions was no longer impressive. It was revealing. Later, as we cleared the dishes together, I realized something that surprised me with its clarity. The warnings had been there, not shouted, not dramatic, just small, steady signals from people who cared enough to notice. I had not missed them because they were hidden. I had missed them because I had not wanted to rearrange my understanding of the life I was living. That realization did not bring shame. It brought responsibility. When I went to bed that night, I felt a shift inside me that was more decisive than anything before. I was no longer just uncovering Michael's second life. I was acknowledging my own role in how invisible it had been allowed to become. That acknowledgement did not weaken me. It grounded me. I lay awake for a while, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, thinking about the conversations yet to come, the questions still unanswered. I knew now that whatever I did next would require me to stay present, even when it was uncomfortable, to listen, even when it was easier not to. And as sleep finally pulled me under, I understood that this chapter of awareness, painful as it was, had given me something essential. Not certainty, not answers, but the willingness to see what was directly in front of me without turning away. Seeing clearly came with an unexpected side effect. It made me quieter, not withdrawn, not distant in the way people notice and comment on, but careful, measured. I stopped filling silence automatically. I stopped explaining myself when no explanation was required. That change alone altered the rhythm of our house more than I would have expected. Michael noticed, of course. He always noticed shifts, even if he pretended not to. He asked if I was feeling all right more than once that week. His tone was gentle, concerned, the same tone that had always reassured me in the past. Now it sounded like a test. I told him I was fine, busy, tired in the way people our age get tired without a clear reason. He accepted that answer easily, which told me something else. He preferred simple explanations, ones that did not require him to adjust. I began to use that preference. Each day, after he left for work, I gave myself a structure, not a plan exactly, more a set of boundaries. I would observe. I would document quietly. I would not confront. I would not rush. The hidden phone stayed in the back of the drawer where I had placed it. I did not check it obsessively. I limited myself to short, intentional looks, enough to confirm patterns, not enough to overwhelm myself. I learned quickly that restraint mattered. Too much information all at once blurred into noise. Instead, I paid attention to my own life. I pulled out old files I had not looked at in years. Insurance paperwork, retirement statements, documents Michael had always said were handled. I did not assume wrongdoing where I did not yet have proof. I simply familiarized myself with the landscape I had allowed someone else to navigate alone. It was humbling, not because I felt foolish, but because I recognized how easily responsibility can be transferred when trust is abundant and time is scarce. One afternoon, I scheduled a meeting with Mark Ellis, the forensic accountant I had been referred to through a friend of Rachel's. I told Michael I had a dentist appointment. He did not question it. Mark's office was unremarkable, tucked into a small professional building near downtown. Neutral furniture, neutral colors, the kind of place designed to fade into the background. I appreciated that immediately. He was in his late 60s, calm, methodical. He asked me what I needed help with. I told him I wanted an overview, not accusations, not conclusions, just clarity. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he said he could not tell me much without documents, but he could explain what patterns to look for. He talked about how money often moves quietly, long before anyone realizes it is being redirected. How small. Regular transfers are easier to overlook than dramatic withdrawals. I recognized the description instantly. He gave me a checklist, accounts, statements, things I should request access to. He did not ask why. He did not speculate. He treated my questions as reasonable, which steadied me more than reassurance ever could. On the drive home, my phone buzzed. A message from Michael saying his afternoon meeting had been pushed later and he would be home late. I replied with a simple acknowledgement. No follow-up questions, no concern. I imagined him reading my response, noting its brevity. That night, when he came home, he seemed almost relieved, as if my calm had confirmed something for him. We ate dinner together, talked about mundane things. He mentioned an upcoming trip, a short one. He said it casually, like a detail that barely deserved attention. I nodded and asked what day he would be back. Not because I needed to know, but because I wanted to hear how he framed it. He answered smoothly. I watched his face, his posture. The confidence was unbroken. That told me something, too. Whatever he was managing, he believed it was contained. I went to bed early that night, claiming a headache. He offered to get me something, fussed briefly, then let it go. From the bedroom, I listened to him move around the house, the familiar sounds anchoring him in the space we shared. I wondered if he felt the same sense of ownership I once had, or if this house was just one stop among many now. The next morning, I began writing things down, not accusations, observations, dates, times, what he said, what he did, what I noticed. I wrote as if I were preparing to explain something to a stranger who had no emotional stake in the outcome. That discipline mattered. It kept me from drifting into interpretation. At first, it felt strange to document my own marriage, invasive, almost. Then it began to feel practical. There were moments of risk, times when I nearly asked a question out of habit, times when Michael looked at me a second longer than usual, as if sensing a change he could not quite name. Each time, I reminded myself that this was not a performance. It was an adjustment. One afternoon, I almost slipped. Michael called unexpectedly while I was reviewing account statements on my laptop. His name lit up the screen, and my heart jumped. I closed the computer too quickly, the movement sharp and unnecessary. When I answered, my voice sounded different even to my own ears. He asked what I was doing. I told him I was organizing old files. There was a pause, just a fraction of a second longer than normal. Then he said that was a good idea, that we should really do that more often. I agreed and changed the subject. When the call ended, I sat very still, listening to my pulse slow. That night, I hid the papers deeper in the closet, beneath winter coats we rarely touched. I realized then that this was the balance I would need to maintain, close enough to see clearly, far enough not to be obvious. As the days passed, something unexpected happened. The fear receded, not completely, but enough that it no longer dictated my movements. In its place grew a steady attentiveness. I began to notice how often Michael assumed I would adapt to his schedule without question, how often he spoke in conclusions rather than discussions, how rarely he asked what I wanted anymore. These observations did not enrage me, they clarified me. I saw how easily I had been managed, not through cruelty, but through convenience. It was easier for him if I did not complicate things, and it had been easier for me too, until it was not. One evening, as we sat watching television, Michael mentioned something about a colleague, someone whose name I had never heard before. He spoke as if this person were familiar to me. I said nothing. I waited. He corrected himself quickly, offering a vague explanation. I nodded, eyes on the screen. I felt the subtle shift again, the way he recalibrated when he realized he had overestimated what he had already told me. That recalibration was becoming more frequent. I did not know yet where this would lead. I did not know how or when I would step out of the role I had been playing so reliably for so long. What I knew was that I was no longer moving blindly. Each day added another layer of understanding, not explosive revelations, but a slow accumulation of truth, enough to support weight. Late one night, lying awake beside him, I stared into the darkness and felt something settle fully into place. I was no longer trying to protect the version of my life that had existed before. I was preparing for the version that would come after. That preparation did not feel like revenge. It felt like readiness. And readiness, I was learning, was its own quiet form of power. Readiness did not make me reckless. It made me patient. That patience was tested sooner than I expected. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped into my email between a store receipt and a reminder about a prescription refill. It was for a local fundraising event, one of those community mixers that promised light appetizers and meaningful connections. Michael's firm was listed as a sponsor. I almost deleted it without thinking, the way I usually did with things like that. Then I noticed the date. It was the same evening Michael had mentioned a client dinner earlier that week, the same night he had already marked off as unavailable, delivered casually as if it were settled. I sat very still at the desk, the screen glowing in front of me. This was not confirmation of anything new. It was something else, an opportunity. And when Michael came home that night, I waited until dinner was finished and the dishes were done before mentioning the email. I kept my tone light, curious but not invested. I said it looked like a nice event and asked if he was planning to attend since his firm was involved. The shift in him was immediate, though subtle. His eyes flicked away for a moment, then back. He said he had forgotten about that it was probably something his assistant had handled. He said he already had plans that night. I nodded and said, of course, just thought I would ask. The answer itself mattered less than the way it had landed. Over the next few days, I paid attention. Michael became slightly more careful, not distant, not defensive, but alert in the way someone is when they sense variables they have not accounted for. He asked about my plans more often. He checked in when he usually would not have. I adjusted accordingly. I mentioned errands, a coffee with Rachel. Nothing specific, nothing that could be cross-referenced. The night of the event arrived warm and clear. Michael dressed with particular attention, choosing a jacket he rarely wore and shoes he had polished earlier that day. He told me he would be late, that the dinner was downtown and traffic would be a mess. He kissed my cheek and asked if I needed anything before he left. I said no. I wished him a good evening. After he drove away, I stood in the living room for a moment, listening to the house settle. Then I changed clothes. I did not dress dramatically. I chose something understated, something I might wear to any community event, comfortable, familiar, I wanted to look like I belonged anywhere I happened to be. The venue was only 15 minutes away, a renovated community center near the harbor, the kind of place that hosted everything from wedding receptions to charity auctions. The parking lot was already half full when I arrived. Inside, the room buzzed with low conversation and clinking glasses. I recognized several faces immediately: neighbors, acquaintances, people I had exchanged pleasantries with for years without knowing much about. It felt like stepping into a photograph I had been part of without realizing it. I took a glass of wine from a server and moved slowly through the space. I did not search for Michael right away. I wanted to see how this world arranged itself first. It did not take long. He stood near the center of the room, engaged in conversation with a small group. His posture was open, confident. He laughed easily, gestured as he spoke. He looked entirely at home. What struck me was not that he was there. It was that he was different, not in a dramatic way, just enough that I would not have recognized this version of him if I had passed him on the street. His voice carried differently. His attention moved quickly from person to person, practiced and smooth. This was not the man who complained about being tired at the end of the day. This was someone energized by the exchange. I watched him for a moment longer than I should have. Then I stepped closer. I did not interrupt. I waited until there was a natural pause, until someone shifted and created a small opening in the circle. I stepped into it and smiled. Michael turned and saw me. For a fraction of a second, his expression emptied. Not shock exactly, calculation. The moment was brief, but it was unmistakable. Then the mask returned. He smiled, greeted me warmly, asked what I was doing there. His voice was steady, pleasant. Anyone watching would have seen a husband surprised but happy to see his wife. I said I had received the invitation and thought it would be nice to stop by. I mentioned the firm's sponsorship. I said it lightly, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The people around us reacted with polite interest. Someone commented that it was always good to see spouses supporting one another. Another asked how long we had been married. Michael answered without hesitation. 22 years, he said, pride evident in his tone. I looked at him and nodded, letting the number hang there. The conversation shifted. Introductions were made. Names exchanged. I shook hands with people Michael clearly knew well, people who had never heard of me. That was when I felt it, the collision. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a quiet misalignment. Someone mentioned a trip Michael had taken recently, speaking as if I had been there. Michael corrected them quickly, saying I had not been able to make it. His explanation was smooth, but the timing was off. Too quick, too practiced. I watched the faces around us register the discrepancy, then moved past it out of politeness. No one said anything. No one needed to. The rest of the evening unfolded with careful choreography. Michael stayed close to me, closer than usual, as if proximity alone could smooth over the unevenness. I played my part, responding appropriately, asking questions, laughing at the right moments. Inside, I was cataloging everything. The way he steered conversations away from certain topics. The way he answered questions directed at me before I could respond. The way his hand rested on my back a second longer than necessary. This was not affection, it was containment. At one point, he excused himself to take a call. I watched him step outside, phone to his ear, posture tense. I did not follow. I did not need to. When he returned, he suggested we leave soon. He said it had been a long day. I agreed easily. In the car, the silence stretched. Michael asked if I'd enjoyed myself. I said I had. He nodded, eyes on the road. After a moment, he said he had not realized I was interested in attending things like that. The comment was framed as casual curiosity. I heard the question beneath it. I told him I had not realized he was either. He laughed lightly, then let the subject drop. At home, he poured himself a drink and went to change. I stood in the kitchen and stared at the counter, the familiar surface grounding me. What had happened that evening was not a revelation. It was confirmation. His two worlds were not meant to touch, and the effort required to keep them separate was greater than he wanted to admit. Later, lying in bed, I replayed the evening in my mind. Not the conversations, but the energy, the subtle strain beneath his composure, the way he had recalculated in real time. That strain was the first visible crack. I understood then what the stakes really were. If his second life became visible, even partially, the carefully constructed narrative he relied on would falter, not just with me, but with everyone who believed in the version of himself he presented so confidently. That knowledge did not make me feel powerful. It made me cautious. I turned onto my side and closed my eyes, aware that something had shifted permanently. The balance had changed. He knew now that I could appear where he did not expect me, that I could occupy space he had assumed was his alone. The next steps would require precision, not force, not confrontation, just presence, applied at the right moment. As sleep finally pulled me under, I held on to that understanding. The collision had happened. The damage was subtle, but it was done. He did not bring up the event again, which told me more than if he had. Silence had always been his preferred way of regaining control. If a topic went untouched long enough, he trusted it would dissolve on its own. I let a few days pass before I did anything that might disturb that assumption. Life returned to its familiar rhythm on the surface. Breakfasts, errands, short conversations at the end of the day. I did not change my behavior dramatically. That would have been suspicious. Instead, I allowed a small, deliberate shift. I asked questions that sounded casual but were not. I listened more than I spoke. One evening, as we were clearing the table after dinner, I asked him how the trip downtown had gone the night of the fundraiser. I phrased it as an afterthought, the way spouses do when a detail surfaces late. He paused for a fraction of a second, plate in hand, then said it had been fine. Productive. He said the traffic had been terrible. I nodded and dried my hands on a towel, then said I had enjoyed seeing some familiar faces at the event. I mentioned a name or two, people we both knew casually. His shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. He asked who I had spoken to. The question was light, but there was an edge beneath it. I answered honestly. I told him I had chatted with a couple of neighbors and met some people from his firm. I said they seemed nice. That was when he looked at me fully, studying my face as if searching for something specific. He smiled and said he was glad I had come, that it was good for people to see us together. The phrasing mattered, people, not he. Later that night, after we had settled into the living room, I brought it up again, more directly this time, not accusatory, curious. I said I had been thinking about how busy his schedule had become lately, how many dinners and trips there seemed to be. I said it made me realize how little I actually knew about that side of his life. He leaned back on the couch and laughed softly, a sound meant to reassure. He said there was nothing interesting to know. Work was work. He said he did not want to bore me with details. I told him I did not find it boring. I told him I found it strange that after all these years, there were still whole parts of his life I had never seen. That was the moment his expression shifted, not into anger, not even defensiveness, but into something flatter, more careful. He sat forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. He said I was reading too much into things. He said everyone compartmentalized a little. It was healthy, he said. He asked if something specific was bothering me. I let the question hang between us. Then I said yes. I said I had come across some things recently that made me realize he had been keeping parts of his life very separate from mine. I did not mention the phone. I did not mention the calendar or the accounts. I spoke in general terms, watching how he reacted. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing this, then said he had not meant to exclude me from anything. He said he thought I preferred not to be involved in the details of his work anymore. He said he had been trying to make things easier for both of us. The words were familiar. I had heard versions of them before, always framed as consideration, as protection. I told him that ease was not the same as transparency. I told him that I had never asked to be shielded from his life. There was a pause. He took a breath and said I was right, that maybe he had made assumptions. He reached for my hand, his touch gentle, practiced. I did not pull away. I let him take it. Then I asked him about the trust. The word landed heavily in the room. He froze, not completely, but enough that it was obvious. His fingers tightened slightly around mine before he released my hand altogether. He asked what I meant. I told him I had been reviewing our financial planning, that I had realized there were structures in place I did not fully understand. I said I wanted clarity. His jaw tightened. He said the trust was nothing to worry about, that it was a standard planning tool. He said he had handled it years ago to simplify things. I asked him why my name had been removed as beneficiary. This time he did not answer right away. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was measured. He said there must have been a misunderstanding. He said paperwork changed sometimes and that he would look into it. I told him I already had. The silence that followed was thick. He stood up and walked a few steps away, then turned back to me. His composure was slipping now, just at the edges. He said I should have come to him first. He said it was not appropriate for me to dig into things on my own. He asked who I had been speaking to. There it was, the pivot from explanation to control. I said calmly that I had not done anything inappropriate. I said I had every right to understand decisions that affected my future. I said I was not accusing him of anything, but I needed honesty. He rubbed his face with one hand, then said he felt blindsided. He said he had not realized I felt so disconnected. He said perhaps we needed to communicate better. The familiar deflection. I listened without interrupting, then said something I had rehearsed carefully in my mind. I said communication only worked when both people shared the same reality. I said I had been living in one version of our marriage while he had been living in another. That was when I saw it. Fear, brief and unguarded. Not fear of losing me, not yet. Fear of losing control over the narrative he had so carefully maintained. He asked me what exactly I thought I knew. I told him enough, not everything, not details, just enough to make it clear that I was no longer operating in the dark. He leaned back against the wall and crossed his arms, creating distance. He said he needed time to think. He said this conversation was becoming emotional. I almost smiled at that. Instead, I nodded and said I understood. I said we could talk more later. I said I was not going anywhere. The last part was deliberate. That night, we went to bed without resolving anything. He lay awake longer than usual, shifting beside me. I remained still, my thoughts steady. I had not confronted him to force a confession. I had done it to establish a boundary, to let him know that the quiet compliance he had relied on was no longer guaranteed. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house changed. Michael became more attentive, more careful with his words. He offered explanations where he had not before. Small ones, incomplete ones. I accepted them without comment. Behind the scenes, I continued preparing. I met with Daniel Moore, the attorney Rachel had recommended. I asked questions about rights and options, not accusations. I wanted to know where the lines were before anyone tried to move them. Each conversation added weight to what I already knew. Not panic, not urgency, just structure. Michael did not know how much I had learned. That was intentional. One evening, as I was sorting through mail, He mentioned an upcoming meeting and paused, then added an explanation without being prompted. I looked up at him and nodded. The recalibration was constant now. I understood then that the confrontation had done what it needed to do. It had destabilized his certainty without provoking open conflict. It had shifted the balance just enough. What came next would not be decided in a single conversation. It would unfold through actions, through choices made when pressure increased. As I turned off the light that night, I felt something settle in my chest. Not relief, not triumph, clarity. I knew now that whatever version of himself Michael had been protecting, it was beginning to crack under the weight of being seen. The days that followed unfolded with a strange, quiet intensity, like the air before a storm that never quite broke. Michael moved through the house with an attentiveness that bordered on courtesy, explaining things he had never explained before, mentioning meetings in advance, checking in when he would be late. Anyone looking from the outside would have seen improvement, effort, a husband trying. I saw something else. I saw a man adjusting to new constraints. He was careful now about where he went and how he spoke about it. His phone never left his side, yet he guarded it less obviously, as if trying not to draw attention to the guarding itself. He volunteered information in small doses, the way someone offers coins to avoid opening a vault. I accepted everything he gave me with calm gratitude. I did not press. I did not challenge. I let him believe that his explanations were working. Behind that calm, things were already in motion. Daniel Moore had been clear in our meetings. Knowledge created leverage, but timing determined outcomes. He advised patience, documentation, and restraint. He explained what transparency looked like under the law and what secrecy cost when it unraveled. He spoke without drama, without judgment. That steadiness anchored me. I gathered what I needed quietly: bank statements, insurance documents, trust paperwork that Michael had assumed would never require my attention. Each piece fit into place with unsettling precision. The picture that emerged was not explosive, it was methodical. Michael had not been reckless. He had been strategic. He had arranged his life to minimize friction, not only with me, but with systems that might question him. Accounts were not emptied. They were redirected. Names were not erased. They were shifted. I saw now how his second life was supported by the first, drawing resources and credibility from the marriage he still presented to the world. That realization hardened something in me. This was not about romance or desire. It was about control. The consequences began to ripple outward before he realized they were connected to me. A colleague called him one evening, voice raised enough that I could hear the tension from across the room. Michael retreated into the den, closing the door more firmly than usual. When he came back out, his face was tight, his movements clipped. He said something about a misunderstanding at work, a scheduling issue. I nodded and asked if everything was all right. He said yes too quickly. A few days later, he mentioned that a planned trip had been postponed. He framed it as an inconvenience, but I recognized the undercurrent of frustration. His schedule was tightening, options narrowing. I knew why. Information had a way of traveling when it was no longer protected by silence. I had not spread rumors. I had not made accusations. I had simply stopped covering for him. I declined invitations he assumed I would decline anyway, and attended ones he assumed I would ignore. I spoke to people with openness, with warmth, without offering explanations for his absence. I let others notice patterns for themselves. Nothing I did was dramatic. That was the point. Michael began to sense the shift. He asked more questions. He hovered in doorways. He attempted conversations that circled back to reassurance, to shared history, to reminders of who we had been. I listened. I did not argue with memory. I did not deny affection. I simply did not allow nostalgia to rewrite the present. One evening, as we sat across from each other at dinner, He said he felt like things were slipping. He said he did not understand how we had arrived here, distant and careful with each other. He said he wanted to fix it. I looked at him and felt a wave of sadness that surprised me with its depth. I told him that repair required honesty, not performance. I told him that closeness could not exist alongside omission. I said these things quietly, without accusation. He did not respond right away. He stared at his plate, then looked up and said he felt judged. He said I was changing the rules. I said the rules had always been there. I was simply enforcing them now. That was the first time he did not have an answer ready. The following weeks were marked by subtle losses. A partnership he had relied on cooled unexpectedly. An opportunity he had assumed was secure became uncertain. These were not disasters. They were inconveniences, frustrations, small cuts. They accumulated. Michael grew more restless. He slept poorly. He paced. He spoke more sharply than he intended, then corrected himself. I recognized the pattern of someone losing control over a system they had designed to run quietly. I remained steady. At Daniel's advice, I took formal steps. Nothing public, nothing confrontational. I ensured my name was properly positioned where it should have been all along. I documented discrepancies. I prepared. Michael noticed changes in our mail. He asked questions I answered calmly, truthfully, without elaboration. Each answer reminded him that I was no longer passive. One afternoon, he came home early. He found me at the dining table reviewing documents. He stood there longer than necessary, watching. He asked what I was working on. I told him I was organizing my affairs. The emphasis was deliberate. He nodded slowly, then said he thought we should talk. Really talk. He suggested counseling, collaboration, a reset. He spoke as if offering a solution. I listened, then said I was open to conversation, but not negotiation over reality. I said I was not interested in preserving an arrangement that depended on my ignorance. He stared at me, searching for something that was no longer there. That night, he slept in the guest room. The distance between us was no longer implied. It was structural. In the days that followed, decisions were made, not loudly, not all at once. Papers were filed, accounts were adjusted, boundaries were formalized. Michael signed what he needed to sign with visible reluctance, his signature careful, controlled. He told me he felt cornered. I told him he felt exposed. There is a difference. By the time the separation became undeniable, the second life he had built was already collapsing under its own weight. Without the stability he had drawn from our marriage, it lacked foundation. Relationships that thrived in secrecy withered under scrutiny. Arrangements that depended on his availability faltered when his time was no longer his alone. I watched this from a distance, neither celebrating nor intervening. What surprised me most was not his anger, though there was plenty of it, but his confusion. He seemed genuinely baffled that things were unraveling without a dramatic confrontation, without a single explosive moment he could point to as the cause. I understood something then that I had not before. He had believed that as long as no one raised their voice, nothing had truly changed. He was wrong. One evening, weeks later, I stood alone in the living room, the house quiet around me. Michael was gone for the night. I did not ask where. It no longer mattered. I looked around at the space I had shared for so many years and felt a sense of gravity rather than grief. What was ending had already ended. What remained was simply catching up. I did not feel victorious. I felt intact. The second life he had guarded so carefully was no longer separate from consequences. It was visible now, diminished, unable to exist without the scaffolding of deception. I turned off the lights and went upstairs, aware that the final shape of what came next had not yet been revealed. But the direction was clear. The reckoning had begun, not with fury, but with the quiet certainty that things could no longer continue as they were. What came next did not arrive with drama or raised voices. It arrived through paperwork, schedules, and quiet decisions made in daylight. The separation became official on a gray Tuesday morning. We sat across from each other in a small conference room downtown, neutral walls, neutral furniture, the air faintly smelling of old carpet and coffee. Michael looked smaller there, not diminished physically, but stripped of the confidence that had once filled every space he entered. He signed where he was told to sign, his pen moving slowly, deliberately, as if careful handwriting could regain some measure of control. I watched without gloating, without satisfaction. What I felt instead was a deep, steady calm. This was not a victory, it was a conclusion. When we left the building, we did not speak. He walked to his car. I walked to mine. Two separate paths, beginning where one had quietly ended long before. The house felt different once he was gone. Not empty, but honest. The rooms no longer held the tension of unspoken calculations. The silence was not something to manage or interpret. It simply existed. The first few weeks were strange in ways I had not anticipated. I missed routines more than the person. The sound of keys in the bowl, the way someone else adjusted the thermostat without asking. Absence reveals habits more clearly than love ever does. Friends reached out carefully, uncertain what to say. I told them I was all right, and for the most part, that was true, not healed, not fully settled, but steady. Rachel came by one afternoon with soup and no questions. We sat at the kitchen table and talked about everything except Michael. That, more than anything, felt like a gift. The consequences of his second life continued to unfold at a distance. I heard fragments through shared acquaintances, a professional setback, a partnership dissolved, invitations no longer extended. The world he had curated so carefully did not collapse overnight, but it thinned, losing substance as scrutiny replaced secrecy. I did not follow these developments closely. I did not need to. What mattered was that my life was no longer shaped around accommodating someone else's omissions. I took steps that felt small but meaningful. I rearranged the living room. I planted new flowers in the backyard. I changed the locks, not out of fear, but as a statement to myself that this space was fully mine now. One afternoon, months later, I found the old phone while cleaning out a drawer. I held it for a moment, feeling its weight, remembering the woman I had been when I first pulled it from beneath the car seat. Careful, doubting, afraid of her own instincts. I turned it off and placed it in a box with other things I no longer needed to carry forward. What surprised me most about this ending was not how strong I felt, but how ordinary that strength became over time. It was not a dramatic transformation. It was an accumulation of small choices made consistently in my own favor. I learned that being excluded from someone's life is not the same as being unwanted. Sometimes it is a sign that you have outgrown the role they assigned you. Looking back, I see now that the second life Michael was living did not begin as a betrayal meant to destroy me. It began as convenience, as control, as a series of decisions that prioritized ease over honesty. That does not excuse it, but it explains how easily it hid in plain sight. I also see how often we are taught to interpret discomfort as something to smooth over rather than examine. How many times I dismissed my own unease because it was easier than questioning a structure that appeared stable. If there is one thing I know now, it is this. Clarity rarely arrives all at once. It builds slowly, through attention, through listening, through the willingness to stay present when something feels off instead of rushing to make it comfortable again. I do not tell this story because I believe everyone's marriage hides a secret phone or a second life. I tell it because many lives hide quiet exclusions that are just as damaging if left unexamined. If you have ever felt like a guest in your own relationship, if you have ever sensed that parts of the truth were being managed rather than shared, I hope you take that feeling seriously, not with panic, with curiosity. Pay attention, ask questions, learn the shape of the life you're standing in. And if you are watching this and something in it felt familiar, I would love to hear from you. You can share your thoughts, your experiences, or simply say that you were here and listening. Stories like this do not end when the telling stops. They continue through connection. If you want to hear more stories about quiet reckonings, late awakenings, and the strength that comes from seeing clearly, stay with us. There are more voices worth hearing and more truths worth telling.